Welcome. Today, we're going to discuss honeybees and humans, ancient connections and North American introductions. And this talk is really just to kind of give you exposure to the history of beekeeping, where this activity of humans working with honeybees really began, and also then moving into North America and talking about how bees were introduced into the United States, North America, and then also where we're at kind of now, what's happened over the course of time as bees have become a very large part of American agriculture. So this is going to be a really just kind of a fun overview, give you a little history so you know kind of where you're coming from. You know, as a new beekeeper, it's always nice to have a frame of reference for where we came from as an industry. And the reason I say that is because if you think about it, out of all the insects in the world, honeybees are the only insect that we manage for their food. And their food is the only insect food, honey, that humans eat. So the relationship we have with bees is very unique and very special when it comes to our relationships with other invertebrates. So that's where we're going to start with today, give you a little bit of background. And so there's a lot of stories that go around honeybees and where they originated from. And really, the story of honeybees starts in ancient Egypt. And the myth behind where honeybees came from is this myth right here. This is a passage from a translation of the Egyptian magical text. And what it's saying here is it's giving you the idea of where Egyptians thought bees came from. And it says, when the sun weeps a second time and lets fall water from his eyes, it's changed into working bees, and they work in the flowers of each kind, and honey and wax are produced instead of water. Now, what they're referring to here when they say the sun weeps is they're referring to the sun god Ra. And the sun god Ra is in Egyptian text is where honeybees came from. And so the connection between honeybees and this god Ra, honeybees are essentially an extension of that god. And what they're able to do because of that relationship with the sun god Ra is they can produce honey instead of water. Now, when you think about that as an old culture, a culture where beekeeping really started in about 2400 BC, that culture, when you're in those kind of ancient cultures, you know, there's not refined sugar around. And so finding a natural sweetener source, something that's as sweet as honey and then has all the other properties of honey, including healing properties for wounds, all sorts of things. This product of honey was really considered as a gift from the gods. And gods were linked to bees, not just Ra, but also other gods. And so the god Osiris, who is the god of the dead, he was worshipped in a place called the Mansion of the Bee. And we also see in the Egyptian texts and in the hieroglyphs of the kings, the pharaohs of Egypt, that from the beginning, from the first dynasty of ancient Egypt, that the kings, those pharaohs, were always associated with the bee. And specifically, it was the kings of Lower Egypt that were always the ones that were associated with the bee. And now what I mean by that is when we look at the cartouches, which are the royal names of pharaohs, we see the image of the honeybee in those cartouches. And so this is an example of one of those individuals. This is Tutmosis III. And this cartouche at the Temple of Hatshepsut is a literal name. It's literally his name, his royal name. And so the royal name is made up of several different pieces. And you can see that here. So we have the Horus name, the Netbee name, the Horus of gold, and then the throne name. Now, the throne name is where I want you to really, really focus on, because the throne name designates where that pharaoh, where his dominion is, where he rules. And in ancient Egypt, the way that we denoted if you were a ruler of Upper Egypt or Lower Egypt was through this imagery right here. And there's two images that are circled here. The one on the left, this one here, is an image of the sedge plant. The one on the right is the image of the honeybee. And the difference there, if you were a ruler, if you were a pharaoh, and you had the sedge and the honeybee, it meant that you were the ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt. If you only had the sedge name in your throne name, it meant that you were the ruler of Upper Egypt. If you only had the bee, it meant you were the ruler of Lower Egypt. Now, some of you might not have your Egypt geography all the way down, and so I just want to illustrate what we're talking about here. So when we look at this map of Egypt and we have the Giza Plateau up here, that's where the Great Pyramids are. That's Lower Egypt. And then we have Upper Egypt, which is more of an area that's known for the Valley of the Kings. And so when we look at images, the Valley of the Kings here, what we're talking about when we're talking about Lower Egypt is we're talking specifically about the place where the Sphinx and the Great Pyramids are. That whoever ruled that area was called a bee king. So you should readily recognize how important this was in Egyptian culture. The bee was so revered that it was actually something that the rulers were named, that were called. So where they ruled was denoted by either the sedge or the honeybee. And the reason that Lower Egypt is the place where kings were known as bee kings is because that's where beekeeping began. Now, there are other places in the world where humans were wild harvesting honey. And we know that humans have been wild harvesting honey since about 12,000 BC. We have cave drawings in Spain and in Asia where people are wild collecting honey. And that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here that is so special in Egypt that happened is that during this time, 4,000 years ago, Egyptians started actively keeping bees, human and bee interaction. We began managing bees like other livestock. And bees are the only insect, even today, that we manage like livestock. So really important to recognize this is where this all originated from, is the lower, the Giza Plateau, Lower Egypt, about 4,000 years ago. Now, why was Egypt the place where this all started? Now, Crane has this really wonderful book that goes through the entire world history of beekeeping. And what he says in this book is that there are essentially 4 factors that really came together in Lower Egypt. And the result of it was that humans actually started to understand that they could manage bees. And so these circumstances created a situation where humans began managing them as livestock. And what are the things that really, what were those factors? Well, one of them is that there was just a ton of resources around. So Egypt is a very warm place, very temperate. And during this time, this was a huge area of agriculture. The Nile Delta was irrigating crops all around. They were managing irrigation very well. And this was a very lush growing area for food. And so there was just always a ton of foraging around. But there was a shortage of nesting sites. So bees are cavity nesters, and they need a cavity to nest in order to build combs. They're not, honeybees are Apis mellifera, as a honeybee, does not produce open combs like other honeybees. So this bee in particular needs cavities, right? And so that is what we mean here by a shortage of nesting sites. The other things that was going on here is that there was just a massive amount of population growth and an increase in the standard of living. And so with this kind of revolution of agriculture, we had new demands for wax and honey as products. Now, when it came to nesting sites, there was a really interesting thing that kind of coincided with this time. And that is that this agrarian culture that had been built in Lower Egypt was an agrarian culture that had to move supplies around. And what they used to move things like water or other supplies, or even for storage, were clay pots and baskets. And what would happen over time invariably is a pot would crack, a basket would become, in disrepair, and they would discard them. And the bees would find those pots and create nests in them. And that is where us as humans began to understand that if we could give them a cavity to create honey in, that we could then actively harvest that honey and maintain those bee colonies as beekeepers. Revolutionary idea at the time. The other thing that came into play here is that because of this warm climate, and like I'd mentioned, there's just stuff growing everywhere at this time in Lower Egypt, there was just forage available pretty much year round. So the bees had plenty of food around. They had these new nesting sites that they were utilizing. And it was just like these factors just came together at the perfect time for humans to take advantage of this and to understand that we could play an active role in the lives of bees. Now, the bee that they kept in ancient Egypt is Apis mellifera, and the subspecies is Lamarcki. Now, we in the United States, Apis mellifera is the species of bee we keep here. It's the Western honeybee. But there are many subspecies of the Western honeybee. And so this particular subspecies has some pretty unique qualities. So it's known as the Egyptian honeybee. It's a little darker in color than the honeybee that we're used to, and it's of a medium size, but it's very similar to the honeybees we're used to in the United States. Some of the qualities of this bee, though, is that it did have a very high tendency of swarming, and they're very temperamental. So they do have some temperament issues as well. They're very good. They have very good hygiene, meaning that they clean themselves very well, and that's an important part of maintaining healthy colonies, is having colonies that have good hygiene. One thing that they can't do is overwinter. So they are native to a very temperate area that does not have winters, as we know here in Michigan. And so they don't have the ability to overwinter like the bees that we use, which are bees that are more that are evolved in Northern Europe. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So they don't have the ability to overwinter. They do produce a ton of queen cells. That's one of the things that goes along with their temperament to swarm. And this is the same bee that lots of beekeepers in this region are still keeping to this day. Now, the hive that they used was a cylindrical hive. And the cylindrical hive is something that is still used by some beekeepers in ancient Egypt today. And essentially what it was a tube that was laid on its side. It had a front entrance, which was a hole, and then it had a cap on the back of it. And you would work the bees from the back, and the entrance was on the other side. They're laid horizontally and then stacked in towers. And so you'd have these huge stacks of these clay earthen hives that are stacked one on top of another in an apiary. And we see the evidence of this throughout Egypt in the hieroglyphs of that they have put on walls of all sorts of their buildings and construction places. And so like here we see in the Tomb of Pabisa, we see a relief here at the bottom left of a beekeeper actively keeping bees. The beekeeper right here, the earthen hives, you can see the flat edge here on this side facing the beekeeper. That's where the lid was at. And then the kind of more rounded front end is where the exit was at. And that's where you see the bees coming out of. In addition, you can see this wall painting here from the Tomb of Reckmeyer. And this is literally, and what you see is kind of another image of that down below that makes it a little easier to see. But what this essentially is, what you're looking at in this picture, is a full honey extraction process. When we start at the right here, you have the earthen hives. You have an individual standing up top with a smoker. They're the ones who invented the smoker, as we know today. And then you have this individual down below harvesting combs. Those combs are then passed over to this individual here, who is now crushing the honey, and it's being strained through, put into vessels, stored, or put into vessels and then stored. And to this day, there are still tombs being found in ancient Egypt that have vessels full of honey, because many of the royals and those that were part of the upper class of Egypt were buried with honey because, again, It was a gift from the gods. So something very important to recognize is this huge connection in there. We have, not only do we have evidence of this in hieroglyphs, we also have physical evidence of these old apiaries. And the oldest known bee apiary that has been discovered, to my knowledge, to this day, was discovered in 2007 in Rioth, Israel. And this is essentially an apiary that's from about 900 BC. And you can see these archaeologists here, there's still the lids on some of these hives. And you can see this individual, there's a full row of stacked hives here. So again, now we have physical evidence of this happening thousands of years ago. The cultural practices that were used by the Egyptians, essentially all of the materials that they used were made of earthen materials. So your smoker was also made of earthen materials. And what that was essentially a pile of smoldering cow dung. And the hive, like I had mentioned, you see the hole here on the front, was worked from the back. And so there was the lid on the back that you would access everything that's in the hive. Now, the techniques that were developed in ancient Egypt are actually still used by some beekeepers in Egypt still. They're still using Apis mellifera lamarcki as a bee, and they still are using a process that they used to use for dividing colonies, for making splits, called calling the queen. And that's essentially something that they would do. And usually around February, the beekeeper would come up to the front of the hive and make a sound similar to a queen sound. And basically that when they would make that sound, kind of like a cat sound, it's a queen calling signal. And basically what it is that queens will make this noise to recognize if there's other queens in the hive as they're hatching out. And then they go and seek out those other queens to kill them. And so what you would do is you would make this sound at the front of the hive. If you heard the bees making that sound back to you, you knew it was time to split your colony. And so they would also divide colonies as well. And that's still a practice that's used there today. So this is very historically significant because Egypt really stood as a culture that recognized the importance of bees in their personal lives, the products that they could supply to them and how they could actually keep bees. And so not only did they revere them through art, myth, and culture, but they played such an active role in their lives, and Egyptians began keeping bees actively, that we now, as beekeepers, are essentially part of that historical lineage, going back over 4,000 years of unbroken tradition of humans being the caretakers of honeybees. So what you're embarking on is not just beekeeping, and you shouldn't just think of this as just another farming activity. This is a connection to the ancients. And I truly and firmly believe that the beekeeper is a type of archetype in our history. And it's important for you to recognize that historical connection, because keeping bees is much more than just keeping bees. It has a much more intimate connection that you can access through your own personal practices. All right. That is ancient Egypt. Let's move to North America, where we're at and where we're keeping bees now. So beekeeping in North America, as we know it, really began in the mid-1800s. And the reason that it really began in the mid-1800s is because previous to this, we really weren't keeping the bees that we were keeping, but that we're keeping now. And I'll explain that here in another slide. But the other thing that really happened in the mid-1800s is there was a revolution in beekeeping equipment. And this was done by Lorenzo Langstroth in Philadelphia. And in 1851, when he was working bees, he began noticing certain things. And the things that he started to notice were that, one, when bees were given a cavity to build comb in, they would always build these passageways that were about 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch. And that's a space that's big enough for two bees to pass one another without colliding in the hive. He called this space bee space. And bee space is something that we still observe today in all of the hives that we have available to us. Bee space is incorporated into those hives so that bees can move around the hive without having a bunch of congestion. The other thing that he developed at this time was the idea of removable frames. Previous to this, most of the time, the bees that were being utilized for honey, well, the way we got honey was usually about two ways. They would either humans would be harvesting them from feral colonies and trees and things like that, or if you were keeping them in a box at that time or some sort of a rudimentary hive, the hive was destructively harvested. And typically what that meant is that the bees were killed and then everything was taken. Now, that's not a sustainable way to keep bees. And so what Langstroth came up with was this idea of these removable frames that you could actually work modularly. And so instead of having to do a fully destructive harvest, now you can pull out just frames of honey and harvest those instead of having to mess with brood or anything. And so the hive could stay alive year to year. This was revolutionary. This is the biggest development in beekeeping in the last 4,000 years, point blank. There has been no other invention in our industry that has had as big of an impact. Now, the Langstroth hive that he developed is what you see pictured here, and it's a little different than what we see today. So we always call the hive we work with now as the modern Langstroth hive. It's undergone some design changes. You can see that this is essentially two sets of frames stacked on one another in a single box. And at some point, designers and beekeepers began to realize that it's a lot easier to work those in separate boxes as well. So not only are the frames modular at that point, now the individual hive bodies are modular. And so we've made some changes to this over the years, but the design qualities of removable frames and bee space are still incorporated in every Langstroth hive to this day. Now, previous to Langstroth in the mid-1800s, what was brought over by the colonists during colonialism was what's known as the German black bee, and that is the species is Apis mellifera mellifera. The mellifera is the subspecies, so kind of a little bit of a confusing name, but that's the species that was brought over. Now, the thing about German black bees is that they're very aggressive. They're good honey producers, but they're tough on the beekeeper. And so what happened is during this time of Langstroth, in the mid 1800s, where all of these like revolutionary changes were happening in American beekeeping, is that him and a bunch of other beekeepers started hearing about the Italian honeybee, Apis mellifera linguistica. And they basically started to hear these stories about this really mild-tempered bee that was a good honey producer in Europe. And they started importing queens. And from that is where we're pretty much at today. Italian bees are so that's the Italian bee that we're talking about. Italian bees are still around here in the United States today. You can purchase them from beekeeping supply companies all the time. They have a great temperament, which is what people just absolutely loved about this bee when it came into the United States. And it took off like wildfire. It essentially became the industry standard almost immediately. Everybody who heard about this type of bee, this line of bee, wanted it in their apiary, mainly because it's such a gentle bee to work. Now, not only was this all going on, and with Langstroth and others, but simultaneously, what we can really consider for the American beekeeping industry is that a lot of this was happening in Michigan. There was a lot of work happening in Michigan during this time around beekeeping. And actually, the story of Michigan beekeeping is really kind of the story of US beekeeping, because Michigan is home to the oldest state beekeeping organization in the United States, the Michigan Beekeepers Association, founded in 1865. Still to this day, putting on great conferences and all sorts of educational outreach. So when we talk about beekeeping in the context of North America, we have to observe the importance of Michigan in this whole thing. Not only did we have the state beekeeping organizations that's the oldest, we also have some of the oldest universities that had apiculture educators, people teaching people how to be beekeepers. And in the 1860s at Michigan Agricultural College, now known as Michigan State University, we had a faculty member that came on, very famous individual. 1867, A.J. Cook became the lead beekeeper in Michigan at Michigan Agricultural College. And A.J. Cook, still very well known, the museum, the insect collection that is held at MSU is the A.J. Cook collection. He had a huge impact on Michigan as in the beekeeping industry. And he led that really for about 25 years. He led that effort at MSU. And at this same time, and you actually, that's the picture on there is really an amazing picture of him actually in the first apiary at MSU. Now, at this time, really everybody was moving to Italians, and Michigan really became the epicenter for the queen rearing industry. And so tons of queen rearing was happening in Michigan at that time to supply beekeepers all around the East Coast and the Midwest with this new line of honeybee that was so popular. Additionally, in the late 1800s, we also started to see the emergence of large-scale beekeeping. So previous to this, most people were not keeping hundreds of beehives. But at this time, when we started getting the Italian bee and we started having we started seeing revolutionary products like the Langstroth hive coming out, beekeeping and beekeepers really began to scale up. And so in Michigan, we started to see people with hundreds of beehives now in the late 1800s. And they were also moving those beehives to farms within the state via horse and wagon. In addition, some of the major things that we use today were also invented here in Michigan. So T.F. Bingham from Farwell, Michigan, is the one that's credited with developing the modern bee smoker. It was known as the Bingham bee smoker when it originally came out. And it is just like you see in the design here, it's the same design that we use today. The big difference between the smokers that were used previously to that was that essentially you have the air intake down here on the Bingham smoker, and that allows for that air to be pushed in at the bottom of the smoker and then smoke to be pushed out through the top. Previous to that, the inlets off the bellows were up top. And so you didn't get a good burn through the whole thing. You were essentially just blowing smoke off the top, and it was difficult to keep smokers going. So this, again, another revolutionary invention and something we still use today. And that was developed in 1880. Now we're moving into the 1900s. So 1900 to 1940s, let's kind of get this scope. We've moved out of the 1800s. Things are moving along. Beekeeping has really taken off in Michigan. And Michigan is now the #1 honey producer in the country, and was for a long time. And what we were seeing at that time in Michigan, we were seeing average harvests of about 250 pounds a hive, and getting harvests of like 300 or 400 pounds off of a hive, which is really unheard of today, was not unusual. And the reason for that was because of what was going on in Michigan at that time. And we were seeing areas that were being clear cut, and we were seeing large amounts of dairy pastures coming into Michigan, especially in eastern Michigan and kind of the Thumb area. So these dairy pastures that were being created to graze cows on, primarily at that time, they were using sweet clover. And sweet clover is an excellent forage resource for honeybees. The nice thing about sweet clover, and the reason that we were getting these really huge harvests, is that when the cows would go through a pasture, they nibble off, all kind of the tops of all the sweet clover. And what that does is that promotes another flush of flowers. And so you were constantly having this year-round, or well, not, seasonal flush of sweet clover coming back all the time. And the bees were just eating it up. Sweet clover is an amazing resource for honeybees. The other thing that was happened with clear cutting, and we typically were seeing this kind of in the northern eastern lower peninsula. What we were seeing there is that we were seeing clear cutting happening. And when you clear cut an area, what happens is that generally plants that are very good at establishing on disturbed soils just take over an area. And that's what happened. As we were clear cutting, there were wild raspberries that were just taking over the landscape as trees were being felled. Now, as those trees, as we let those trees grow back up here in the modern era, those raspberry patches are choked out at that point. And so at that time, we were seeing huge harvests, primarily from wild raspberry, which many of the older experts like Roger Huppengarner, who used to be a professor at MSU for many, many years and a beekeeper in Michigan for, I think, about 60 or 70 years, that's one of the things he says, that wild raspberries is one of the best forages that you can have for honeybees. And that's what was driving both the pastures and wild raspberries were really driving a lot of this amazing honey yield. And so what that did is that when other people in other states were hearing about the honey yields coming out of Michigan, if I were to hear about somebody that was making those types of yields, and my first inclination would be well, what's the forage round? But my second is well, what is the genetic line that you're dealing with here? I want those genetics that are bringing in that much honey. And so that drove Michigan to become the top queen producer also in the country. So during this time, Michigan was the epicenter of beekeeping in the United States. Really cool connection that we have, that we live in a state where all of this was taking place at the beginning of the 20th century. All right, so now we're going to move into the 1940s to the 1980s. So some changes really started to happen during this time in Michigan. And what we saw was that farmers were starting to change the livestock feed that they were using. So they were moving from sweet clover as a livestock feed to alfalfa. And that's kind of what we see today, is a lot of alfalfa being grown. Now, alfalfa is a good forage resource, a decent forage resource for honeybees. The problem is that most of the time when we're harvesting alfalfa for feed, it doesn't go to flower. And so there's no flowering resource that's available because we're constantly harvesting it earlier than it's flowering out. So that's something that you have to keep in mind today, and that reduced our honey yields. Cash crops started to move in to replace the dairy industry in eastern Michigan, which also drove kind of that removal of a lot of our sweet clover. In addition, post-World War II, we have the Green Revolution. This is where, we had this essential idea that we had all these chemicals left over from World War II, and people started developing pesticides with these types of chemistries. And so we ended up having products that were starting to be used widely in the agricultural industry for pest management of other insects. Now, the problem with that is that these were broad spectrum pesticides, very toxic, not only to the honeybee or to the insects, but also we would later find out to us as well, and a lot of other wildlife as well. And what this did is that during this time, prior to the Green Revolution, when we had all these agrochemicals coming out, beekeepers typically just kept their bees in orchards because they were, they're good forage areas. But now, especially with the development of DDT, which was just sprayed indiscriminately on everything, including humans during this time, it was seen as like the cure-all for all of our insect problems. And, insects, not only are they attacking crops, but things like malaria were problems. There's also these insect-borne diseases that were problems for humans. And so DDT was seen as like a savior. And during this time, it was literally sprayed on everything. And so what happened is because farmers were spraying their fields with DDT, it was killing off honeybees that were situated in these orchards. And so beekeepers started to pull their hives out of agricultural fields because of the danger of them being sprayed with these chemicals and killing a hive. Now, because of that, because beekeepers pulled all of their hives out of these farming landscapes, that is when pollination services actually became necessary. And this is when we start seeing pollination contracts starting to become something. Michigan had blueberries, cucumbers, cherries, apples, other specialty crops that required insect pollination. But because the hives were not being kept in those fields anymore, they had to hire beekeepers to bring them in. And so that's kind of the advent of pollination services in the United States. Now, also during this time, and it's roughly around the 1950s is when we started to notice this, but around in the 1950s, we saw an invasive species come into Michigan, and that is spotted knapweed. Spotted knapweed is also known as star thistle, just depending on where you're at. It is an excellent honey plant, really loved by beekeepers because of the quality of the honey and the pollen and the amount of nectar that it puts off. However, it is absolutely a huge invasive species, and you can see all over Michigan today. There's disturbed landscapes. Anywhere where there's a disturbed landscape, roadsides, places where people have clear cut or plowed or things like that. Usually the first plant that's going to come into that space is spotted knapweed. And spotted knapweed is much more competitive than most other plants, especially our native plants. And the reason is it has this amazing quality as a plant to protect itself against competitors. What it does is its roots, they exude what's called allelopathic chemicals, and those chemicals inhibit the germination of other seeds. So when you have a field of star thistle, literally it is difficult for any other plant even to germinate in that field. And so you get these swaths of just solid star thistle. Now, beekeepers loved this, but conservationists absolutely hated this. And for the last 20 years, there has been a lot of dedicated eradication campaigns, not just in Michigan, but all over the United States, because it also intrudes on pastures, and it's not good for cattle. And so that's something that has been a point of contention for beekeepers and conservationists for a long time. But that really started to take hold here, and that kind of brought up this new thing where, typically, beekeepers are part of farming and part of kind of the natural system of agriculture. But at this point, we kind of had, we're butting heads with conservationists and even farmers about this particular plant. Now, at this time, also, we were a closed state, and there was a lot of reasons for that. Primarily, American foul brood was really devastating the United States and our beekeeping industry. And if you're not familiar with this pathogen, I'm going to describe it in detail when we get to pests and pathogens as a lecture. But essentially, this is the most deadly disease that we have in beekeeping. It is a disease, a bacteria that basically takes over and it kills the pupae before it's able to hatch out of the capped cell as it's changing from a larval stage to a pupal stage. So when the cap gets put on the top of the bees, that's when this starts to affect the larvae, and essentially the larvae dies, never hatching as an adult. The problem with American foul brood is that the spores themselves can last in woodenware for up to 80 years. So if you get American foul brood in a hive, the solution is to burn everything, even to this day. If you get American foul brood, it's much more rare now. I've only seen a handful of cases in Michigan in the last 10 years. But when you get it, the only solution is to burn your equipment. Now, back during this time, when we were a closed state, and that was because we didn't want things coming in that were transmitting this virus, these pathogens, because we had a closed state, it meant that there was no migratory beekeeping. Nobody was sending bees out of Michigan and they were coming back. You could send bees out, but you could not bring them back in the state. And we had a lot of good control over that. And that served us well for controlling American foul brood. The other thing that may just blow your mind during this time that we were doing, that state apiary inspectors had the right to do during this time, was that they could enter your property, inspect your hives, and if they found American foul brood, they could burn whatever they found that was contaminated without your permission. So it was a very serious thing. This almost brought it, at times, American foul brood was thought that it was going to bring the American beekeeping industry to an end. This was a really severe problem. Something we thankfully got a handle on. Like I said, it's much more rare now, but it does still occur. All right, so now let's move up into the 1980s to today. So during this time, we became an open state, and migratory beekeeping, as beekeepers in Michigan started moving bees out of the state and then back in the state, became a normal thing. At first, there was inspections that were required to come in and out, but in the 90s, that all changed, and now you can basically move bees in and out of Michigan without anybody even looking at them. And so you can make your own conclusions about what problems that can cause as far as the importation of pests and pathogens. But I'll tell you this, if you're bringing your bees to another place and they're around a bunch of other bees, the likelihood is that they're going to be exposed to a bunch of pests and pathogens, and you have the likelihood of bringing those back with you into Michigan. Commercial beekeepers also started moving their bees south for the winter. So they decided that it was better to keep their bees in the south so that they could build them up early in the spring and then bring them up to Michigan as big, strong colonies right at the beginning of the season. In the 80s, we had two major pest introductions. The tracheal mites were introduced in 1985, and then varroa mites were introduced into Michigan in 1987. And the introduction of these two mites was devastating to our industry. And over a short period of time, We ended up losing about half of the bees in Michigan because of these two mites. And to this day, Varroa mite is still our number one problem in the beekeeping industry. If you do not manage Varroa mites, I guarantee you, your bees will die every single year. You may get lucky every once in a while and get one to survive 1 year. But this is what makes or breaks beekeepers. And I have trained thousands of beekeepers all over the world. And when they start taking Varroa mite management seriously is when their bees start to survive, point blank. And I'm gonna beat this to death over the course of this course with you. You will leave this course knowing how important Varroa mites are, how to control them, and how to monitor for them. And if you do anything, that is your number one thing you need to be doing as a new beekeeper, is understand the importance of Varroa mite management and monitoring and control. This also, as we started getting into the commercial beekeeping and migratory beekeeping, all across the United States, we're shipping our bees. This is also the time where almonds start to dominate. So in California, 80% of the almonds in the world are produced. And the pollination event that happens in the early part of the year, usually around February through March, January, February through March, is almond season. And right now, 70 to 80% of all beehives in the United States go to almonds for that one pollination event, the largest pollination event in the world. Why has almonds become such a big part of the commercial industry? And I know many commercial beekeepers that make their living off of this one pollination event. Well, it's because the almond growers get a premium price for their product and they are able to pay a premium price for pollination services. And right now, for every hive you bring out to California and put in almonds, farmers are paying generally around $200 and even more per hive. So if you got a semi full of 400 beehives, that's a big payday. And so many commercial beekeepers make their living off of this one pollination event. Now, I have been a farmer almost my entire life, and I am not going to fault farmers for trying to get their crops pollinated. But what I will say is that as a beekeeper, putting all your eggs into the almond basket is a very, very risky endeavor. It's profitable as all get out, but there are no guarantees. And California, if you're not aware of this, and I am originally from California, California's water issues are known throughout the world. The Central Valley, where almonds are grown, is essentially a desert. And the only thing keeping these plants going is irrigation. And California, for many years, and especially in the last decade, has had water restrictions because of drought that have shut down a lot of farms because they just can't get access to water. So again, you can draw your own conclusions of what could happen for a commercial beekeeper taking that avenue as this is my sole way of keeping bees. All right, continuing on in the modern era, colony collapse disorder. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of this. This was a huge issue, especially in the mid-2000s and through kind of the early 2010s. This issue, colony collapse disorder, we have never really been able to wrap our head around as researchers. And the reason is because there are so many factors that go into colony collapse disorder that it's just hard to tease them out from a research perspective. And typically this only affects commercial beekeepers. And the reason that it only affects commercial beekeepers is because commercial bees are exposed to a lot of stress factors that stationary bees just aren't. Moving on a truck has been shown by research to be very stressful for bees. Going through many different climates in a very short amount of time, being trucked across the United States from Michigan to California, you're going through all sorts of crazy climatic changes during that time. That's stressful. You're exposed to a bunch of pests and pathogens There are agrochemicals that you're exposed to in these fields, a lot of agrochemicals that you're exposed to in these fields. So there's just a ton of factors coming into play. Now, there's been some recent research that's come out that's even said that maybe this was just a point in time phenomenon because we're not seeing it as much as we used to. So it's less prevalent today than it was in the mid 2000s, but it's still something that folks are monitoring. But the reason that we say that this is a difficult thing to tease out is because it has so many factors that are affecting honeybees that we can't control for as researchers. Now, as a researcher myself, someone who has published scientific research for many, many years, I can tell you, you have to be able to control factors to nail down what the single factor is that's causing an issue or the couple factors that are causing an issue. When there's just an unlimited number of these extraneous factors, it is darn near impossible to nail down what is causing the issue. We know mites are an issue. We know agrochemicals are an issue. We know the climatic changes are an issue. We know the transportation is an issue. All of these things are issues. And individually, they can be researched, but together, it's very difficult. So that's a little bit about CCD. You are not going to experience this as a small-scale beekeeper. And essentially what the symptom is that you have a beehive that the hive just totally abandons it. Now, CCD is not the only thing that causes that. And typically, small-scale beekeepers will get very confused about that. I get a lot of calls from small-scale stationary beekeepers who say, Adam, my bees just up and left in the fall. I don't know what happened. Generally, with small-scale beekeepers, and absconding in the fall is due to mite pressure. And we can almost always nail that down with hobbyist beekeepers and sideline beekeepers that are not moving their bees around. Generally, when you see absconding hives where there's just no bees in the hive in the fall, it's because your mite loads were so high that the bees just gave up and left. So that can sometimes be a little bit confusing for folks. Now where we're at here during this time is that we're at a point in time where hobbyist beekeeping has become more popular than ever. I've been beekeeping for 15 years. In the last 10 years, I have seen more hobbyists come into this industry than I can even imagine. I mean, most of the time when I go to conferences and give talks, most of the audience are people who have never kept bees or have kept bees for less than 3 years. Those hobbyists now are one of the biggest threats to our industry. Now, I want to be real honest. Nobody gets into beekeeping to kill bees. Everybody who I have ever met who wants to be a beekeeper is doing it for some good reason. They want to help bees. They want to pollinate their own crops. They want to be self-sufficient, by producing food products like honey. There's also all sorts of great reasons people become beekeepers. But beekeeping today is not like beekeeping used to be. And beekeeping today primarily is varroa management. And so what we see time and time again is that new beekeepers come into the industry very well-intentioned, but they jump both feet into the industry without any education. And beekeeping without education is a zero-sum game. You will struggle nonstop to keep bees if you do not have a foundational education in how to properly manage them and care for them. And right now, the hobbyists that are not taking varroa management seriously or not doing anything at all, and I hear that all the time. I didn't treat at all. I don't know why my bees died. I'll tell you why your bees died. It's from varroa. 9 times out of 10, that is why your bees have died. If your bees died before the first of the year, guaranteed it was varroa. After that, there's a couple other things it might be. But varroa right now has our industry at unsustainable loss levels. And we are seeing annual loss rates of somewhere around 30 to 40%. This has been going on for for a couple decades now. That is an unsustainable loss. In the industry, 15% annual loss is considered a sustainable apiary, meaning you can recover from your losses and increase apiary size without bringing in any new bees. Here in my apiary, we average about 5% annual loss. And I commend you for taking the time to do this course, because I'm going to train you exactly how we keep bees. And my goal is for you to be successful, for you to come back to me next year and say, Adam, all my bees survived. And I hear that all the time from former students of mine. And that's what we want to get you to. And so your education is key. And you taking the steps to get educated, you know, the price of education is your time and sometimes your monetary input. But every package or nuke that you buy to replace those dead bees is going to cost you somewhere between $150 and $200 every single year that those bees die. And so most people that don't take education seriously, they get into a cycle where bees die every single year, and they usually last about 3 to 5 years. And then they finally just give up. And then they sell all that beekeeping equipment for a discounted price. Don't be one of those folks. Take your education seriously. And again, I commend you for taking the time to start your education with us at BeeWise Farms. With that, if you are interested in any of the citations that I have in here, especially around the history of beekeeping, I'm a big history buff and I am a huge Egypt buff. And so if you're as geeked out about that type of stuff as I am, here's the list of the literature that I've cited in this presentation so that you can take advantage and go take a look at those pieces of literature. That's pretty much all on the Egyptian stuff. And then lastly, I want to thank you for being part of this, but I also want to give a special thanks to Dr. Roger Huppengarner, who was an individual that I knew through Michigan State University. He used to be the apiculture educator there for decades. And Roger was an amazing individual and just a lovely person. He passed away last year. And but a lot of the work that you see in this presentation, especially on the modern day beekeeping and beekeeping in Michigan specifically, a lot of that came from a talk that he gave at the 150th anniversary of the Michigan Beekeepers Association. And you can find that full lecture on YouTube. Just search Michigan Beekeepers Association Roger Huppengarner, and you'll find that full lecture. I think it's about an hour, but it's just on Michigan beekeeping. But I want to thank Roger for his work in cataloging this history, because a lot of this history that he has put together for Michigan beekeeping would be lost without him. And so I just want to give my thanks for him and helping document that and me being able to incorporate that into this lecture so that you can also understand the importance of our state and the importance that it has played in American beekeeping. All right, thank you all. We'll see you at the next lecture.